You're watching The End of History, a video essay series about Ridley and Tony Scott. Right now you're watching one of our favorite video essays from the last several years, Alien Covenant Art References by an essayist who goes by Hirazi. It's an astute collection of connections she drew while watching Covenant, and it's also sort of essential to understanding Ridley Scott, the filmmaker.
Because once you start seeing the paintings in his work, you never really stop. The genres changed, the settings changed, the time periods changed, but the painter stayed the same.
American movies were at a crossroads in the 1970s. A class of young genius was taking cinema by storm, but these upstarts didn't want to make yesterday's version of a classic film. They wanted to recreate their experiences as adolescents, as children, and if possible give people new kinds of thrill. Show them new sights and sounds, expose them to new kinds of obscenities. Perversion and erotic violence on the one hand, boyish adventures and first love on the other. That's oversimplifying things, of course, but it's important to show what the boys of what was called New Hollywood, the period of production between 1965 and 1979, had left behind for the Scott boys to complicate.
They wouldn't arrive in America until after the death of New Hollywood. Tony fused those two sensibilities with anarchic glee. Ridley could never fully look back at his life as a young filmgoer. He didn't want to make unserious work, though of course, fate always has the last laugh.
He was and remains besieged by the impulse to find stately Baroque beauty in even the most grotesque things. This scene from Hannibal feels very nearly autobiographical. You can see that nothing pleases Ridley Scott more than the idea of history told through ancient wood carvings of biblical mutilation.
Dante's pilgrim finds Pier della Vigna on the 7th level of the Inferno. Like Judas Iscariot, he died by hanging. So Judas and Pier della Vigna are linked in Dante by the avarice he saw in them. In fact, avarice and hanging are linked in the medieval mind. Now, this is the earliest known depiction of the crucifixion, carved in an ivory box in Gaul about AD 400. It includes the death by hanging of Judas, his face upturned to the branch that suspends him. Here he is again on the doors of the Benevento Cathedral, this time with his bowels falling out.
He was more at home dressing modern genre in the cloak of antiquity, of taking time out of his magnificently violent sequel to Silence of the Lambs to dive into the legacy of a sumptuous depiction of violence.
It's perhaps useful to compare this to Jonathan Demme's original, Silence of the Lambs. Demme's film language is one of trust, of a kind of intimacy between you and the character. You see the world through her eyes, and for every dreadful sight she encounters, Demme is there holding our hand, making eye contact with her, not to soften the impact of the horrific things that happen to the women in the film, but to show you that there is a way to live with violence. There is a strength in acknowledging that the world is a cruel place and helping other people survive in it.
Yes, we may be. Did you take over this place after Mrs. Lippman died, is that right?
Yeah, I bought this house 2 years ago.
Did she leave any records, any business records, tax forms, lists of employees?
No, nothing like that at all. Say, has the FBI learned something? The police around here don't seem to have the first clue. I mean, have you got like a description, fingerprints, anything like that?
No. No, we don't.
Ridley Scott's sequel abandons Clarice's perspective and adopts what we might call his more typical attitude of rapturous observation. The world is, if anything, more cruel and twisted in Hannibal, but his depiction of it is romantic. He turns the crimes of a serial killer into the kind of medieval study that Lecter so admires.
Gain the confidence of a child. I smiled. I said, oh, I see how you do it. Look, a doctor approached me with a piece of broken mirror. Try this.
Try peeling off your face.
I was feeding it to the dogs.
No, I can still see it. Try again. No, I'm afraid not.
It seemed like a good idea at the time.
The operatic tone, the plentiful gore, this is a cinema of decadence. Part Luchino Visconti, part Tobe Hooper. He positioned himself as a court painter in Hollywood. Even movies set in America's heartland have the Byzantine detail and heavenly light of a Rembrandt.
His emergence as a stylist was at once a fitting conclusion to the 1970s cinema of suffering and loss, of losing the freedom of New Hollywood to the emerging age of the rock star producer churning out vulgar product. It's a funny coincidence that Ridley Scott arrives on the scene just as his friend Stanley Kubrick begins slowing down. There is a Ridley Scott analog for nearly every Stanley Kubrick film. And though you can find references to other works of film art very occasionally, Kubrick the American-born Englishman was the only director towards whom the English-born American ever offered consistent homage.
There is an explanation for this, you know.
You're rude! I want to prepare yourself!
How do you like it?
Scott's life was changed when he saw Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey in its original run, and clearly viewed Kubrick's path as the blueprint for a career in image-making. As the popular cinema happily accepted more and more tawdry subject matter and film languages, Scott tried to meet it head-on, but his heart wasn't in disposable entertainments. Sports cars, explosions, and supermodels. The kind of stuff that Tony would show happily. Like Kubrick, his work was steeped in the art and literature of pre-industrial Europe, filling the frame with batteries of extras and getting visible historical detail as close to perfect as he can. Kubrick and Scott both believed in pure spectacle, of really seeing and trusting what was being depicted.
It's perhaps telling that his affinity was more with an independent like Kubrick than with the entertainers who were his peers at the time. He displayed some of the patience of the last of the American film brats in his images of violence, of men dwarfed by alienating urban landscapes. As the way of creating images in the free and wild 1970s gave way to a more dispiriting commercial cinema, Ridley remained in conversation with the image makers who had shown him that film language could be.
Tony found his footing in the wreckage of New Hollywood, forging ties with super producers like Jerry Bruckheimer and Don Simpson that allowed him a measure of creative freedom because his sensational vision of cinema so closely aligned with theirs. Ridley, on the other hand, chafed.
For some clue as to why, look at the opening of the two cop movies the brothers made around the same time. Ridley treats every composition as an opportunity. Tony isn't content to consider of what the eye can make sense. His films move at the pace of the erotic imagination. Ridley wants to revel, to soak in light quality and architecture, in things man-made and natural.
This was in many ways antithetical to classical film language. Each shot is meticulous, but at times narratively superfluous. The idea of the camera describing a milieu with more care than it takes to tell a story wasn't new, but it grew to become the dominant method of filmmaking in Hollywood in the wake of their successes. This made them as many friends as enemies, especially in the critical community. What was so different about their movies?
Well, for a counterpoint to their version of film language, look at this random scene from Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade by Steven Spielberg, made at roughly the same time as Beverly Hills Cop 2 and Black Rain. Spielberg was a new Hollywood graduate, and he was still directing in the same classical grammar with which he became the world's most famous film director.
Our project leader has vanished, along with all his research. We received a cable from his colleague, Dr. Schneider, who has no idea of his whereabouts or what's become of him. I want you to pick up the trail where he left off. Find the man, and you will find the Grail.
You've got the wrong Jones, Mr. Donovan. Why don't you try my father?
We already have. Your father is the man who's disappeared.
Here we see the composition resting on the hat, given to him not by the absent father, but by the father figure who instilled in him the idea of adventure and archaeology.
It doesn't mean you have to like it.
While a distant and untrustworthy anti-father figure who has disappeared his real dad lays in the background. Just like that, Spielberg has told you the story of this movie in 6 otherwise unremarkable seconds.
You've got the wrong Jones, Mr. Donovan. Why don't you try my father?
We already have. Your father is the man who's disappeared.
Ridley and Tony put care into their compositions, but in a much different way. Every shot is the point of the film. The stories were almost tangential. They wanted to paint the world. Indeed, when presented with script ideas, we once heard that they would sit and draw them together, coming up with the movie through images and landscapes.
It's a little thing, but I've always loved that you can tell you're watching a movie by Ridley and Tony by looking at the sky. They look like no skies you've ever seen before, like they were just put up there in watercolors.
Tony was willing to give the people what they wanted. Ridley wanted to make something else, a kind of hybrid of old-school epic filmmaking, 17th century paintings, and sober adult-oriented drama. His was a construction that sat between the serious and the ridiculous. He tends to draw the eye with the zoom lens instead of through blocking because he's gone to great pains to appoint the frame with detailed design and careful lighting and wants to ensure it's all visible. Like many filmmakers as the 20th century arrived, both Tony and Ridley's average shot length shrank considerably as their action got more visceral and frenetic.
Needless to say, they were trendsetters in this way.
Ridley was the more earnest storyteller, never putting himself before the needs of the story, while nevertheless carefully composing everything. He has 2 storytelling modes. There are his socio-political chronicles with casts of thousands, in which he lifts the dust cover off of some point in history and lets us see it from every angle, and his stories of survival. Men and women forced to the brink of the human experience. Pilgrims forcefully ejected from environments in which they had no business.
He was once on the side of the Crusader. Now he seems to be out to punish him for his hubris. Home is what we should chase, not victory in foreign lands. Sometimes he switches between these modes in the same movie. Ridley Scott is interested in how societies are built and destroyed, in capturing history, seeing it like it really happened, in as convincing terms as he can manage without forgetting his audience's attention span.
Tony believed in the individual. Rogues and pirates out for number 1, men at the center of enormous conspiracies.
But they shared this chiefly among their fixations. Violence should be visceral poetry. Let's take a look at 2 action set pieces from each of the brothers in 2005, as scenes of carnage are so integral to both men's style. Both scenes are evidence of the brothers' methods in microcosm. You can find everything they do best as filmmakers in their approach to murder and mayhem.
Both of these sequences involve roughly the same amount of players, albeit at 2 completely different points in history. Tony wasn't interested in the past. Ridley, I don't think it's a stretch to say, saw himself as a translator, like Longfellow handed the Divine Comedy. An artist whose job it is to render any given time period, past, present, or future, in the most convincing and beautiful fashion imaginable. Even grim streets in New York look like little kingdoms. Film was as much a design challenge as a dramatic one.
Tony approaches his movie Domino, probably his most personal film, about a celebrity bounty hunter chasing the excitement only found when breaking the law with people you love, with what we would call a perfectly American sensibility. He uses pop music, dozens of angles, frame rates, and editing techniques. This scene has 3 different music cues in it that range from rock to opera. No stylistic choice or technique is off limits as long as it adds to the sequence.
The cumulative effect is the height of postmodernism, Godardian anarchy transposed to the godless W. Bush years. But where so many sequences like this in similarly pitched movies don't pack as strong a punch, Tony is able to achieve success because the entire film uses the same grammar as a confessional device.
When I was a little girl, my father told me that if you weren't careful, you could lose everything you've ever earned in life in a split second. You have to know when to cash out.
This is what Tony wanted life and art to be. Images and ideas at 100 miles an hour, trusted cohorts at your side, dying for your art. This entire phase of his career has him firing on all cylinders stylistically, so that his films knock you off your axis from the moment they start. They force you to kneel at their feet.
Ridley, on the other hand, shoots this sequence in Kingdom of Heaven with a much more traditional approach. The color grading and lighting are consistent from shot to shot, the visuals are clearer, the snow in the air. A favorite Ridley visual hallmark is to add depth to each composition, no matter how short the shot length. The angles chosen don't distract from the action, they highlight it, taking you from one sword blow to the next. He slows the frame rate and the sound mix to highlight his point-of-view character's mental state and physical pain. He uses one clear music cue for the length of the scene, paced carefully to highlight the ebb and flow of the action.
The final point we choose to recognize is the violence being done. In Domino, bullets and explosions rock the set and several people are killed in the process. But the deaths of the henchmen are abstract, cartoonish even. Men throw up their hands and fall to the ground. It's only when Mickey Rourke and Edgar Ramirez are shot that the scene comes into emotional focus. In Kingdom of Heaven, nearly every death plays out in gruesome detail. We're meant to feel every single blow. Tony's vision, where only the survivors matter, won out in the end. It became the dominant point of view adopted by the popular American cinema. But we'll get to that later.
Like Virgil and Dante on their journey in the Divine Comedy, Tony and Ridley Scott both wanted to show us hell, so we would appreciate heaven, however we defined them.